Good evening. Welcome to the Pearl Report. I'm Diana Lin. Some of Hong Kong's most important stories might forever be repeated with critical information missing. We don't have a public records law, so we can't be assured of seeing the full account of how government decisions are made and for what reason. As producer Chris Lincoln reports, the history being made around us right now in Hong Kong might not be recorded.
It's 1 week after Northeast New Territories protesters stormed the Legislative Council. Police are in place early to make sure this doesn't happen again. One man is outside the central government headquarters, watching with an eye on the future.
100 years later, if you want to know why the police are so serious about this, you have to look to the record of the Security Bureau. If I want to study the whole issue, I would look at the Development Bureau, the agency that is responsible for the development of the Northeast New Territory.
But he can't be certain records of these events have even been made. Since he left his job as the director of the Government Record Service, Simon Chu has argued GRS has to be supported by an archive law.
If there is no archive law in Hong Kong, requiring the official to create a record and keep the record 100 years later, you don't have this kind of record to look at. That means you really don't know what is going on. Events today will just disappear in history.
And that's where Hong Kong is now. Nothing compels government to create records of any government business, or to turn those records over to the Government Record Service when they're no longer part of an active file. That's from the simplest data to the highest level policy deliberations. Ombudsman Alan Lai said this spring in one of his final reports.
Legislation appears to be an effective way of ensuring bureaus and departments' compliance and minimizing arbitrary or unscrupulous handling of records.
Government says,
whilst not underpinned by law, the current administrative records management regime is binding on all government servants.
Since the GRS-administered scheme started operating in 2009, there have been 17 cases of discipline, 14 for loss of records, 3 for unauthorized destruction of records. The penalties? A verbal warning in 9 cases, a written warning in 7, and a so-called severe reprimand with payment for lost government property in 1 case.
Those aren't exactly the kinds of sanctions you find defined under an archives law, where it's fines, suspension from work, possible firing, possible jail time.
Digital records, by their very nature.
Archivist Stacey Belcher Gould is originally from the United States. Like Simon Chu, she is a member of the Archives Action Group, pushing an archives law for Hong Kong. The government later told us only routine records were lost or destroyed, nothing with archival value. It also said management of bureaus and departments decide whether anyone is disciplined for not following the administrative regime, not GRS, the supposed authority.
As far as I'm concerned, the majority of the electoral members, they know the issue. They think that this law should be passed. But because before they hear it from Beijing, whether they should support this law, they will say nothing.
3 years ago, former legal sector legislator Margaret Ng moved a motion for government to consult the public, then enact an archives law.
And the irony was that the motion was defeated with almost no vote against it. It was simply that people who supported it were outweighed by people who sat there and abstained. So people don't want to oppose it, but they just don't want to support it.
Government has asked the Law Reform Commission to study records management elsewhere and suggest whether Hong Kong should have a law. It's been working on this for more than a year.
As the problems involved are rather complicated and controversial, the subcommittee has not yet set an expected completion date.
An archives law would force government to make and turn over records on contentious issues like Occupy Central or face criminal penalties. When records are eventually open to the public, say 30 years later, scholars might find the truth.
There are deliberations, there are written records, and from these records we can know whose opinion held sway, who was the most influential, who was the most important, and how did other stakeholders in this, other players in this, react to their views.
John Burns is the Dean of Social Sciences at Hong Kong University. He uses records for his research.
If we had the absolute complete record, I would go first for the Chief Executive's office. Records of his meetings with the security people, with the liaison office, with his political advisors, with the central government would be critical. We also should be looking at Executive Council records.
The CE's office told us that since 1997, 1,001 files have been turned over to GRS for permanent retention. 631 files have been approved for destruction.
Files of what? Are those meeting minutes? Are they agendas? Are they the CE's calendar? Are these policy drafting documents?
The public isn't told which ones or
how big is a file? Is it one manila folder? Is it one piece of paper? Is it a meter of shelf space?
What do CE records say about the July 1st march?
Since 2003, these have become political marches, and the reason for this is precisely because governments can fall as a result of activity that happens here on the street. This is exactly what we saw on 2003. C.H. Tung left office 2 years later, in part because of the way the demonstration and the Article 23 fiasco was managed.
This year's march has provoked allegations from both sides. Police have charged Civil Human Rights Front organizers with violating the terms of the procession agreement. They said a rally vehicle moved too slowly along the route. Marchers asked why they were stuck so long in the same spot in Causeway Bay.
We've been stuck here for more than 2 hours. It's terrible. I think they're really making it difficult for us to even participate in the march today.
Was it a police tactic?
Part of their strategy, we guess, would be to bring them through here slowly. You know, this would have a kind of negative impact on whether people would participate in this kind of activity in the future.
Eventually, part of the crowd tried to break through the barriers so the march could spread to both sides of Hennessy Road.
There's a dynamic in this process that's going on, and it's changing every day. And the written record is one way, probably the only key way that we can understand, looking back, what happened. Here we are in a public park, Victoria Park. Meetings are held here on June 4. Meetings are held here on July 1. We always come here to express our discontent. Yet it is a place that the government controls. The government determines how many will enter, how many will exit, what speed they will exit. And so it is not just owned by the people, it is a place that government imposes control. We don't have the government records about how this place is managed, the government's considerations for crowd control and control of dissent. Yet this would be available if we had some kind of proper legal archive system.
When we asked whether records of meetings had been made, the Security Bureau told us
close liaison has been maintained among government departments on law and order and internal security issues. Relevant records would be maintained on such liaison as and when appropriate.
As a historian, I have a stake in this. It's part of my job to use these documents. My original research was on the state finances of England in the 1530s and 1540s. And that's where I first came across government records. The more recent projects have been on the history of education in Hong Kong, particularly of Hong Kong U.
And the first thing that comes to Peter Koenig's mind is the Robert Chung affair. In the summer of 2000, Professor Chung said he'd been pressured by the university to stop his popularity polls on Chief Executive Tung Chee-hwa.
The message was that the Chief Executive had indicated to the Vice Chancellor that he did not like the opinion polls that we were conducting.
The allegations caused the university to appoint Justice Noel Power to lead an inquiry. It lasted 11 days. Tung advisor Andrew Lowe admitted arranging a meeting with the Vice Chancellor to ask about Chung's public opinion program.
Didn't you think perhaps I better tread rather carefully now?
Yes.
Because academic freedom's coming into this. Did you think that?
I didn't think that.
You didn't think that?
Ideally, we would be able to go to the Chief Executive's office to look at the documents that were produced at the time, produced perhaps by the legal advisors to the Chief Executive's office.
I have never asked anyone in the University of Hong Kong to request Dr. Robert Chung to stop conducting his opinion poll.
Tung declined an invitation to appear at the inquiry.
There'd be a range of internal government memoranda, letters perhaps, memos by various people. And under normal circumstances in other jurisdictions, these would all become available after 30 years, say.
The panel found Chung to be an honest witness, but it said neither Andrew Lowe nor Vice Chancellor Cheng Yu-chung were completely truthful about what was said when they met, and that covert attempts were made to push Chung into stopping his polling. The Vice Chancellor and his deputy, Wong Siu-leung, left their jobs when the inquiry ended.
It was embarrassing for the university to have it demonstrated that it was allowing pressure to be exerted by the government. So I think both sides came out of it badly.
The summer struggle 2 years ago was over mandatory teaching of national education in secondary schools.
From the government side, there should be a wealth of documentation which would enable a historian to work through the national education issue from the first time it's mentioned, the first person who comes up with the idea, all the way through to the decision not to go forward with the policy.
We asked government whether records have been made and kept, and it told us
the Education Bureau follows established procedures to manage records of the meetings and discussions in relation to the moral and national education curriculum.
The policy shift was announced in early September.
Under the new policy, the so-called 3 years deadline for implementing the subject no longer exists.
This was quite a stunning thing that the government suddenly realised there was so much opposition to the policy. So how does government deal with that sort of criticism? How do they move forward in those circumstances? I think in any other jurisdiction in the Western world, you would expect after 30 years to be able to have access to most of the documents.
When we come back,
within the government, we don't have a clear set of laws how detailed the records need to be kept, how long the records need to be kept.
Frustrated legislators